If you've been reading Appramada recently, you may well have noticed, and hopefully you've read, a very long article split into three parts by Archera called "A Good Heart Is Not Enough." And it's really, really good to read it. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And I have with me the author, and I've also got Pragni Nandi. So why is Pragni Nandi here? Because she wrote an email to Archera after having read the article. And well, she said something very interesting. I'll hand over to Archer, who's going to read that email to you.
Thank you, Ratnaguna. So I'm Archer, the author of that article. And I received an email just a few days ago. Hi, Archer and Ratnaguna. Thank you for posting these articles on A Good Heart Is Not Enough. I have found them fascinating. I think it's really important that other views are heard within Triratna. I have taken time to read the articles carefully and reflect on my responses to them. Personally, I have left-wing views, and my first response was, I don't agree with what is written here. However, that is just a view. I decided that it would be really helpful for me to use the principles outlined here, which I absolutely agree with, to investigate the topics you use as examples, Achara. When I did this, I found I came to completely opposite conclusions than the ones you have drawn, and I found that fascinating. It seems to me that part of the problem with discussions in controversial areas is that people can use the same processes and come to widely differing conclusions based on other conditioning. I believe that people coming to different views are all sincerely trying to explore the problem, but that as soon as we try to discuss on an open forum, the discussion gets very polarized very quickly. So I'm wondering if we could discuss our different views without doing so on an open page on a website. I would really like to explore why we have different conclusions. It would help me understand some of my friends who have very different views to my own. Would either or both of you be willing to enter into this exploration? I'm hoping that we can find a language and the willingness to explore difference in a way that is supportive rather than confrontational. Just a thought, maybe we could meet up. So I replied immediately to say I appreciate the spirit in which you've written, Pranyanandi. And yes, I'd be delighted to what you suggest. Thanks. I've been looking forward to this. And we did talk about the possibility of doing it on Zoom. Here we are. And we agreed that this may or may not make it to publication. So just wondering if there's any more I should say about myself or the article. Maybe just say that I wrote an article in three parts. I have a fascination with wise policy writing and processes. And I thought recent events made some very good material to give something specific and not end up with something that was too abstract. So this was an attempt to lay down some principles that I thought led to wise policy making. Probably enough from me.
Yes. I just have to tell our viewers, if we have viewers, that I won't be taking much part in this because I haven't read the articles as carefully as Pragnanandi. So this is really a conversation between Pragnanandi and Archua, and I may come in at some points. I don't know. I wonder, Archua, whether it might be good to just go through the five, or at least mention them, the five principles that you outline.
Yes. So the first principle was to look at a problem in the round. The second principle was to be aware of trade-offs, and trade-offs there's never, in my view, there's never a complete solution for every positive effect we try and achieve. There's something, there's usually some adverse factors that need to be taken into account. The next one was to be aware of assumptions. That was the third one. The fourth one was the power of groupthink, and how to recognize and work with that. And then the fourth one was just to hone truth finding, hone our truth finding ability. and that was a very, I won't go into that, but that drew on a Buddhist epistemology, which was intuition grounded in reason, confirmed in experience and testimony of the wise. So there you go. There was a quick whistle-stop tour. But Pranyanandi, maybe it'd be good to hear from you, you know, what you did appreciate and what you did find useful in the article, because you said you had welcomed it.
Yes.
And then we can move on to what it was that you thought was maybe at odds with what I'd written.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you've used very, very controversial topics, haven't you? Things that have provoked wide discussion within Triratna and within society generally, and some very, very extreme positions, I think, potentially have been taken. We're talking about things like COVID, aren't we? And vaccination and lockdowns, that sort of thing. There's a lot of heat in these discussions. I've wanted to explore them for quite a long time, but somehow every time it's come up, it's usually been on sort of a website somewhere, and it's very, very quickly got to the point where I didn't want to be on the website because of the way that the discussion had stopped being a discussion and started to be an attack. And so I'm interested in this. I'm interested in how we can actually disagree better, really. How we can try and hear each other rather than shouting at each other. So when I saw these articles, the first thing that struck me was how clear they were. Yeah? How carefully constructed this argument was. How it followed logically. So I could really, right from the start, I thought, well, this is really interesting, actually. And then almost immediately you gave your principles, which you've just outlined, about things like looking at the problem in the round. And I thought, okay, I agree with those principles. Those are the principles I would use. So this is going to be really interesting, I thought. I went on reading the article. And then you got to what you call angles in the paper, which is the other stuff, the intuition grounded in reason and so forth. And I thought, I agree with all of those too. Yeah. Mm. And then you start using specific examples. And each time, the conclusion that you came to with the specific example was the opposite to the conclusion that I would have come to. And then I thought, well, that is fascinating because we're both sincere. We're both using the same principles, but actually we don't agree. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, well, perhaps I need to look deeper. What is behind using those principles for us that colours our understanding? And that's what I found really useful. That process of saying, I have to go deeper in the process, not the specific outcome.
Yeah, actually. Excellent. Yeah. Was there more you wanted to say, or can I respond?
No, I think I'd like you to respond if you would.
Yeah. Well, I'm really pleased that your principal attention was on the process, which you thought was valuable, because that was why the article was written. It wasn't a covert way of taking a policy position. In fact, in at least two places, I point out that I'm not drawing any policy conclusions. I am raising areas that I don't think they're controversial, but I know they're not accepted in a mainstream narrative. And I was raising them not as final positions, but actually a consideration of these matters would look at some of the factors that I covered. That I didn't assume every reader would find them controversial, but it was quite a concern as I wrote the article, because I didn't want to bounce readers. That's why I was so pleased to get your email. I didn't want to bounce readers say, well, I just don't agree with that, because actually there were no policy positions or conclusions in there. You didn't have to work too hard to guess that some of my conclusions may differ from the mainstream, but I would really like us to get into that. I'd like us to unpack that a bit, because if you said to me, okay, well, what would your policy position be, Achra? I honestly don't have one. I wasn't burdened with making a decision on behalf of a public centre with all the different ramifications and considerations. And I don't know where I would have landed. I say that with complete honesty, because it would have depended on the conversation and depended on which, if we go back to the principle of taking things in the round, it depends which aspect you preference. Is it hardcore Buddhist practice? Is it the medical concerns of your community? Is it how you look to the wider public? What I think I called as social concerns. So I really did not. It pleases me to get an opportunity to say this. I didn't have a fixed position on policy recommendations. But I felt that to just introduce principles in an abstract way wouldn't really engage the reader. So I did take something that was engaging, I think.
Yeah, and if this had just been abstract, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Because in the abstract, I agreed with everything you said. It was only when it came down to specific examples that then I was sitting there thinking, okay, and why are my conclusions different?
Oh, well, let's hear that, because you're a scientist. And you might be looking at things more accurately than some of my... It wasn't even innuendo. There was only considerations in this article. So, but give me an example of where you thought it had gone adrift.
As I say, it's not the principles. I think where we might differ is the weight that we put on different parts of the process. Does that sound as though it might make sense?
Yes, yeah. I'd like you to give me an example.
Well, for example, intuition. I'm really interested in hearing from you, actually, what you think intuition is. Because I'm not sure that it's necessarily the same thing that I think intuition is. And I think that might be at the root of where our differences spring from. So if we're making policy and using your angles, that first of all, there's an intuition about something, and then we look to ground it in reason and find the experience, and then take the testimony of the wise. The whole thing starts with intuition, doesn't it? And I'm interested in your definition of that. How do you see intuition?
So I think there are different levels of intuition, from almost... there can even be powers involved. I talked about that in the footnotes, where one just through extrasensory ability has some conclusion. But I really omitted that from the essay. This was a hunch based probably on life experience that we can't yet articulate. So we generally, when I've looked at intuition with groups, what we've discovered is that it's a word that's used for a whole range of things, from an extraordinary abilities that you cannot explain how someone knows something and turns out to be right, to a deeply attached view that one really can't be diverted from. And it gets labeled intuition. So I was defining it as a healthy hunch that one can't I said two things really that one can't initially articulate, and one that should always be subjected to reasonable inquiry, some rational investigation. And by experience, I meant data. I didn't mean, it wasn't a poetic word for I'm really good at this and I know what's needed here. By that, I meant what would you observe? How could you test? Given that the reason policy writing is so difficult is you're making guesses about the future, and you're trying to intuit processes, and this means, one, it's very difficult. It means, two, there's no room for dogmatism because you're making a prediction and you cannot be dogmatic about a future outcome, particularly given the law of unintended consequences. So does that help? Does that unpack what I mean by intuition?
Yes, I think it does. And I think it does explain one of our differences, because I think my definition of intuition is a bit narrower than that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Say more.
So that in my experience, when I have an intuition about something, it's usually a statement of, I believe this or I don't believe that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that then tends to colour everything that follows on from that, actually. So if I make a statement that I think that idea is wrong, yeah, then when I go looking for information, I tend to be drawn towards the things that kind of connect with that feeling.
Yes, yeah.
So that I put more weight on things that actually back up what I originally thought. And the reason that I originally thought that in the first place is probably unconscious assumptions. So that they're not even conscious enough for me to know what they are. And therefore I find intuition is maybe a good starting point, but doesn't tend to lead me into the open-mindedness that I need in order to make a good decision on the basis of that. It doesn't, as I say, raise a question, it makes a statement.
Yes. Yeah.
That, yeah. I don't know, how does that, yeah.
Well, I like what you've just said. Because you're talking about, I'm hearing you as talking about a confirmation bias, which we all have. It takes a high degree of generosity and openness to really look in a balanced way at everything. But I don't see intuition as thwarting that if there is a willingness to look at data, apply reasoned thought, and seek some testimony of experts. And of course, these are all fraught. Each of these is fraught.
Expert, particularly.
Yeah, they're all fraught.
Yes.
I see intuition as, something we need to sit very loose to. I call it a blunt instrument. I didn't use it. I didn't use that phrase in the essay, but I regard it as a blunt instrument. There are exceptions to that. I think at the end of a long life well lived, some people have canny intuitions based on unconscious recognition of patterns, and they can't fully explain where their accuracy comes from. So I think part of good policy writing is knowing how much weight to put on our intuitions and knowing where it sits on this spectrum from an absolutely attached dogmatic view to a quiet voice that shouldn't be ignored. That's part of the beauty of it.
And I think that part of the difficulty with policy making actually is that that takes time. You really do have to sit back and listen for quite a long time.
Yeah.
And also, there may be other driving forces that you've got to make a decision now. It's got to be the right decision. It's got to be, and that doesn't necessarily allow you to have that openness. I also think that if you haven't got a Dharma background, you're not necessarily thinking in terms of openness, actually. You're thinking in terms of actually right or wrong, or rather than skillful or unskillful. And that does make a difference when you're going through these processes. It really changes your entire outlook.
Yes. But so far I'm hearing us as very much on the same page, like this is a process that you would use. Intuition can be trusted to a degree. We're flawed. We never have enough time. There's nothing I disagree with. It sounds like there was some content, and it might be worth exploring. We may have to reverse back out of content, but by content I mean specifics. It sounds like there were specifics in there where you thought, I come to exactly the opposite conclusion, or very different.
Okay, I thought we might get here, so I did think of one particular example, and it's the example of ivermectin.
Oh yes,
actually, which I thought was possibly the easiest one to look at, because it's a very straightforward question, isn't it? Which is, does ivermectin help people recover more quickly from COVID?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is one of the examples you used, isn't it?
It is. Yes. Yeah. Well, I pointed people to data.
Yes.
What I was challenging, more than advocating for ivermectin, what I was challenging was the wide assumption that there was nothing could be done, that this was entirely new, and doctors who tried to come up with treatment protocols were actually professionally hounded. So I was touching on that. And also, I mean, I would not, I do actually know how to look at clinical trials now, and there are some medics in the family. But I would never be audacious enough to even mention a treatment protocol unless I thought there was data, extensive data with good chain of custody. And in this particular case, actually, I don't know if you went to the footnotes, there was a very good resource. So
is that LIM?
Well, LIM was one of the trials.
Yes.
That was an outlier, but there was. It's possible to look at over 100 trials, and the results were aggregated. So, what am I trying to say here? What I was inviting the reader to do was just look at, actually, there is a way of assessing the efficacy of something, or to the fact that there might be treatments actually changes the landscape. That was all I was trying to do.
And I think I understood that was what you were trying to do. So I didn't know these papers. I went and had a look. Yeah, actually, because how could I make any considerations if I didn't come and have a look, you know? And I thought, okay, these results are interesting. And then I thought, what do their peers say about these papers? So you talk somewhere about replication and about that sort of thing. Can these results be reproduced? What I found was, in this particular case, that there's an awful lot of suggestion that, in fact, the research that found that is it ivermectin? Is that how you pronounce it?
Ivermectin, yeah.
Ivermectin was actually effective, was based on poor quality information in the first place. Yeah. And that is why, in the end, the consensus has been that ivermectin would not be being used as a treatment for COVID. So I got a couple of, and I agree with you in things like you need meta-analyses and that sort of thing. Of course you do. And yet I found an absolutely lovely paper whose title is The Lesson of Ivermectin. Meta-analysis based on summary data alone are inherently unreliable.
Did you go to the meta study that aggregates all the results? Did you go to that footnote?
I went to several of them. I found several meta-analyses that aggregated results, and I found that they differed.
Yes.
In their conclusions. Yes. So again, I'm not a medical scientist.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult for me to say, actually, this is correct or this is not correct.
Yes.
I'm also not a statistician. That's not my training.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very difficult for me personally to analyse whether or not the statistical methods were correct.
Yes. Yes.
But when I find report after report after report saying there's a problem with this, there's a problem with that, there's a problem with this, there's a problem with that. One of them I read, and I couldn't find it again when I was looking up for this, actually said that they mentioned one of those reports that you mentioned and said, we don't understand why this report gets such different conclusions, why this research is so strongly in favour of this, when everything else that we've looked at isn't. And they weren't dismissing it, actually.
Yes.
They were simply saying, we don't understand why this has happened.
Yeah? Might be good to follow up after this meeting. We could exchange some. Because I've gone into this in some detail and I'm satisfied, but that doesn't make me right. And it's not actually material to the article because it's not. It was, why did I even introduce it? Because I know this is, I know this can be problematic for some people. It was, because I don't think if you come back to policy making, actually we're not being asked to make a policy around whether a drug gets used or not. It was more to open up the rhetoric around it's vital that everybody gets vaccinated. And it was saying, actually, I don't think it was more complex than that and not so clear cut. And I know even that also divides opinion, does it not, for many people?
It does indeed. I do think it's important that people get vaccinated. And I'll be quite open about that, actually. I'm clinically vulnerable. And for me, that's quite an emotive issue, actually.
Yeah.
But you're right. This did lead into that and did actually, set me thinking about, okay, and that does lead into, should we be getting vaccinated or not? Or are there other ways that we could be treating this?
Yes. And sorry, could I just interject quickly? Of course, I wasn't taking a position on that. I was exploring, should vaccination be mandatory for participation?
Absolutely.
Which is very different from should someone take a personal decision to have a vaccine.
Yes. And I think that is part of the difficult for policy making, part of the difficulty, isn't it? Because there are always conflicting interests. You use examples of, for example, what if somebody couldn't come into the centre unless they'd been vaccinated and then was harmed by the vaccination? Which I thought is an absolutely standard question you need to ask. What would that be like? But you could also say, what if somebody came into the centre who wasn't vaccinated and then had the disease and passed it on to somebody else who was then harmed by it?
Yes.
So there's always two sides to it, aren't there?
Yes. That's part of the trade-off. That's part of the trade-off thing.
Yeah, and that trade-off thing is in a sense at the heart of it, isn't it? It's always going to be a trade-off. There's no such thing as a right decision, actually. And what trade-offs we're prepared to make do depend on our assumptions and our backgrounds, don't they?
They do. So that's why I said at the beginning, I don't have a policy conclusion. It wasn't that I'm indecisive or that I'm well, it wasn't any of that. It's that this, I can't foretell what the wisest policy would be. But I do think you stand a better chance if you take into account looking at it in the round, trade-offs, the fact that there was conflicting data around, because I'd like to follow up on some of the, without us getting into our axioms or assumptions.
Absolutely.
Because I think that would take us too far off course. But the fact that some of the statements that were in the Widestream narrative actually needed to be audited. And I'm not sitting here dogmatically saying whether they're right or wrong, but they were very crucial assumptions. And even getting to a position, well, I don't know, and that means there's a different policy decision from, well, it's this or it's that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I agree with you. And I think we agree. Good policies do have to take into consideration everything you've said.
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't have any disagreement with that. It's just that I think our underlying conditioning probably skews where we come to.
Well, you're making an assumption there.
Yes,
I might
go
say
on.
so.
Yes.
Well, because I held an identical position to you on a number of things till I looked at data.
Yeah.
So
maybe what we need to be thinking about is testimony of the wise then. What do we think is wise? What is it about that particular data that actually changed your opinion but didn't change mine, if you see what I mean? What was it, if you see what I mean?
Well, I think there's two different categories here. So when I looked at the data, it wasn't I looked at when I took the counsel of others. So there's two different subjects here. There's interrogation and audit of the data. Testimony of the wise I touched on. That's a very difficult subject. What I did was suggested that if people don't look at the problem in the round, they don't talk about trade-offs, if there is a degree of silencing, and if they have some assumptions that are questionable, then they may not be, you may not come to regard them as wise. So it's very difficult, isn't it? I mean, this was a particularly fraught area because, everybody's become the world's useless expert on viruses and immunity now, haven't they?
Quite. Very few of us are, actually. Yes.
No, I understand that. And I'm not posturing as someone who knows a huge amount. Although with my engineering training, I know how to look at data and statistics.
Yeah,
and again, I don't say that to take the high ground. That doesn't make me right, but I'm quite audacious in those areas. And as an engineer, I'm used to double and treble checking, because there's an acid test with engineering. If you think something's going to work and it blows up. So you do become very, very rigorous. Again, to repeat myself, I don't say that to prove I'm correct. It's just this is in my DNA. I do check things.
Absolutely.
When I'm told them.
And my background, which happens to be mostly in physics, again, I dealt with a lot of data.
Yes.
And you did have to make decisions about whether or not an outlier was actually something you needed to be following up on. So that's something that doesn't fit a trend.
Yes.
If I may interject just for a while, there's something you said a little while ago, Andy, which was very worrying, because Archer had said there's 181. Somebody's done a meta-analysis of 181. I think that's the number, isn't it? Looks at ivermectin. And you found two other meta-analyses, I think. So there's three altogether, is there? And they came to distinct conclusions. And that's worrying for me, because I thought a meta-analysis would bring it all together and tell us the truth.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem, isn't it? And this, as I say, this paper where I found where meta-analysis could be inherently unreliable was quite a shock to me. Yes.
It's a shock to me.
Yeah, and I think I can summarize it by saying is that what you have to go back to is the quality of the individual patient data. So if your meta-analysis only includes stuff where the original data wasn't very good, then the meta-analysis potentially is going to be less valid.
Mhm.
Would you
Mhm.
agree, Artura?
Yes, yes, and there was one source in there that I particularly liked because it allowed you to look at every single trial, and that
Yeah.
included the limitations. I don't know if you've been in the comment stream. There was one reader who said, you're very mistaken, even mentioning the possibility of effectiveness, and the quoted two trials. Those two trials had multiple fatal procedural errors
That's
in
the
them.
problem. That's the problem, isn't it?
It is. And there's also, you may or may not agree with this, but there was a great incentive to demonstrate that there was no possibility of a treatment other than emergency, unlicensed, untested vaccine. There was an incentive for that.
I think there was an incentive for that, but I also think that governments would have jumped at the chance of having a readily available drug that was already being tested and was cheap.
That's a good point.
If they thought that it would actually work.
Yeah,
I think
and I
they'd have
shouldn't
rushed for it.
Yeah, and I shouldn't ascribe motives. That's never very helpful or scientific.
Yeah.
So, but just finishing maybe on ivermectin, if you haven't had a look, and I could send you some more. Actually, I put together a small a small group of us where we actually went through this data. I know most people don't have the time or the interest to do that. But one of the references, it lets you audit every single thing. So I agree with what you just said, that you have to be very careful with meta trials. A lot of the trials weren't statistically significant, although it is permissible to aggregate to some extent.
And that does help the results.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's extremely difficult.
Yes.
If it is not your field, really, to be able to know.
Yes. I'm beginning to regret I included it in the article.
Yes. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It's just
it's fine. It's fine. I mean, I knew it was certainly it was certainly garner interest.
Yes.
And it also, in passing, it illustrates that we're talking about axioms. What are the starting axioms that you assume, and it illustrates the difficulty of even recognizing the assumptions we're making.
And I think that is a fundamental thing, isn't it? We don't usually stop to think about what our assumptions are.
Mm-hmm.
You just get that statement, I don't agree with this. That's wrong.
Yes. Yeah.
And then we don't usually go back and say, why am I thinking that?
Mm-hmm.
We start from that point as being, that's how it is.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think in policy making, that's very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Because my assumptions are not necessarily your assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore my views are not necessarily your views.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to lead to an immediate conflict in discussions on policy making.
Yes, I was interested in your email, Andy, where you thought it was worth saying that you were left wing.
Yes.
And I wondered what that was to do with the topic. Did you assume that Archer was coming from a right wing position?
I think, to be fair, I did actually, and I need to say
what made you think that?
Because in the debates that I've heard previously, people with more right-wing opinions tend to be saying the sort of things that Arturo was saying.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that may simply be my limited experience. Yes. Yeah. But that is my assumption.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I should put it in because I wanted to be clear about that.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I sort of intuited that you'd assumed that.
Yes.
And
that may not be valid, actually, and I apologise if it's not valid.
In a way, it doesn't matter if it is or isn't valid, because there was nothing in that article that I regard as to do with the right-left wing dichotomy, other than a section where I said I reluctantly touch on this, which was where we stand in terms of collective action versus individual responsibility.
Yes, and I think that does come into that left wing, right wing
It does,
split,
yeah.
doesn't it?
Well, it does in my
Yes.
head anyway. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think my position is actually that we need both.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I don't think there was
yes.
anything.
Okay, now isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I just don't think I just cannot map this article and the process onto right left, other than us recognizing where we are on a spectrum of collective, if necessary, dictated action compared with individual. It's more the libertarian spectrum. So I did touch on that, but that was only a few paragraphs in 35 pages.
But isn't that interesting? That my assumption out of this was that you probably were right wing. Now, doesn't that say something about the whole discussion, if you see what I mean, of the difficulties of policy making? That I had, without even realizing it, put a left wing, right wing.
Yeah, it doesn't fit. It might fit in other things I've said and written, but not here. It doesn't.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to say that, and for me to hear that. You know, it's important. Thank you for bringing it up, Ratnaguna. Yes,
you're welcome. And I think probably we should begin to wind up this discussion. It's been really good, actually, really brilliant. Thank you both. Any last thoughts before we end?
Actually, I've really enjoyed talking to you, Archer. Yes. It's
reciprocal.
It's been a very good discussion, I thought, actually. Yes, yeah.
It has.
And I think quite an important discussion, actually, too. So can we talk about this? Yes, we could, actually, couldn't we? Yes.
Easily.
So, thank you both again.
Good. Anything else first end well, or is that is there any other footnotes from?
I don't have anything. So.
Well, thank you again for writing. I really appreciated the opportunity, and to clarify my own thinking, I don't regard it as complete. It's not the easiest subject to write about, how one comes to wise policy conclusions, but you'll gather, I think it's an important subject.
Yeah, I really do think it's an important subject as well. And I think actually it's been very interesting just talking about it. Just, okay. Gives me things to think about.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Good.
Okay, thank you both.